Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Jonathan Crush. I'm the director of Hungry Cities Partnership and the MiFOOD Network. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this MiFOOD Network webinar, especially those who are here for the first time. So it's actually the 19th webinar in our MiFOOD series, a series that began during COVID, and we've continued since on a monthly basis. Anyone interested in previous webinars can find them online at our new website. That's MiFOOD, mifood.org. It's customary for us to begin these webinars with land acknowledgement. That's acknowledgement that the Balsillie School of International Affairs is located on the shared traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And despite being the largest reserve demographically in Canada, these nations now reside on less than 5% of this original territory. Our aim in these webinars is to present some of the latest research and findings on issues of food systems, food security, with a sub-focus on mobility and the relationship between these things. It's to showcase the research that's coming out of the MiFOOD Network and the Hungry Cities Partnership. But we also like to invite friends from allied project initiatives to present on pressing topical issues. And then more recently, we started to showcase recent important book publications and invited the authors of these books to join us and to talk about their book and to field any questions they might have. So I'm particularly pleased then today to introduce Dr. Dan Warshawsky and his new book, Food Waste, Food Insecurity, and the Globalization of Food Banks, which is published by the University of Iowa Press. Dan is an associate professor in the School of Social Sciences and International Studies at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, where he also directs the Master of Public Administration program. Before coming to Wright State, he was an assistant professor and director of graduate studies in the Spatial Sciences Institute at the University of Southern California. In 2022, he was named the Frederick White Distinguished Professor of Professional Service for his service to Wright State University and the broader Dayton community. I'm not going to say anything more about the book. I'm going to hand it over to Dan shortly to introduce his really important book on the globalization of food banks. We'll ask Dan to talk for about 20-25 minutes. And then we'll have the rest of the hour for Q&A. And I'm pretty confident there'll be a lot of interesting questions on this particular timely topic. So please, as Dan's speaking, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and I will come back after Dan has spoken, and we'll have a discussion based on questions that are raised. Okay, so over to you, Dan, and very warm welcome to our webinar series and to the MiFOOD Network.
Thanks, everyone. Jonathan, I really want to thank you for the invitation to come today. Really excited to talk about my book. Going to share my slides here for us all so we can see. Hopefully everyone can see the slides and excellent. Okay. Like Jonathan mentioned, I'm an associate professor at Wright State University, which is in Dayton, Ohio, in the US. And I'm really excited to talk about my new book publication, which is called Food Waste, Food Insecurity, and the Globalization of Food Banks with the University of Iowa Press. The work that I'm going to talk about today and really all the research that I've been working on for the last 15 to 20 years is really in this broader context of urbanization and the challenge to build livable cities. And, I see food along with water, sanitation, health, energy, all these basic needs that people need, right, to be alive. And so food is one of them. And I see this in this broader context of thinking about the urbanization of poverty and the need to build livable cities, particularly in the global south. My particular focus has always been trying to understand what institutions are going to ensure that these cities are livable. And so the question is, are we thinking about government? Are we thinking about the private sector, civil society? And then at what scale? I'm a geographer, so I'm interested in scale from the local, national, global scale, et cetera. So there's a whole mix of possible solutions that we could be thinking about when we're thinking about these issues. Like I said, I'm thinking in particular around food systems, particularly around governance challenges. We all know that food access questions in the urban context are different from the rural context. So if we're trying to take sort of a big picture view here, we have some really kind of new challenges when we think about a lot of the growth of large cities, particularly in the global south. And what I'm most interested in, what I've spent the most time in over the last few years, and what I'm going to talk about today is this map. I'm a geographer. Like I said, I love maps. This is a map of food banks across the world, and this map continues to be filled in over the years. And there's a number of different networks which are active here, which I'm going to talk about. There's really sort of a few central research questions which the book talks about and which I kind of want to speak to today. And that is, how and why have these food banks developed across the globe? What are their impacts? And then what role do and should they play, these food banks, in the governance of food systems? And so what I'm going to do is first talk a little bit about this trend of the globalization of food banks, looking at a couple case studies, South Africa, India. Then I'm going to talk briefly about food banks in the COVID era, particularly in Europe, and then sort of end by trying to think about, what we can learn from these experiences in these different places. So like I said, I've spent a lot of time looking at food banks. I had an interest in food banks growing up in Cincinnati, which is actually where I live, kind of come full circle here. But just down the road, I started volunteering at a food pantry in near downtown Cincinnati. Then continued my interest after I graduated from the University of Illinois. I was looking for work, and there was an AmeriCorps opportunity for somebody to do gap analysis around food banks in small towns in Illinois. Then I was looking at food banks in Chicago for my master's. And then when I went to California for my doctoral studies, I said, okay, I'm finally done with food banks. No, I was not done with food banks. This is when the Global Food Banking Network developed, it spun off Feeding America, which is the largest food banking network in the United States. This is about 2006. And that's what really took me on this journey to understand food banks in the global south in particular. So I've spent a lot of time looking at food banks, in part because they continue to grow and have great influence. So I thought it was going to be sort of just a short-term interest, but has been more of a long-term interest. So most of what I've looked at, like I said, is in these try to, there's a lot of territory to look at, but methodologically, most of it has been interviews of people who run food banks, governments, departments, agencies, food businesses that are tied to food banks, people who receive food from food banks. So trying to get a full picture here of all the different players involved, all the different stakeholders. So I think this research is important because food banks, of course, are expanding across the globe in more than 100 countries. But more than that, I think they also reflect the what I would call more a common trend of NGO corporate philanthropy initiatives to kind of attack and deal with great issues of the day. So if we're thinking about food insecurity and food waste reduction, this speaks to that. A lot of companies these days are very interested in promoting their sustainability initiatives, and they see this kind of work as being able to pursue that. And so what we've seen is really a convergence of a lot of interests. Government often like food banks because they help sort of deflect attention from some of the maybe the things they're not doing, and it's a project that they can sort of almost take credit for. Companies like to jump in the arena, particularly for this sustainability initiatives that they can kind of tie the food bank to. And then a lot of folks in civil society are interested because they have a great passion. So there's a lot of different reasons why people are interested in food banking. So what are food banks? Food banks often are increasingly looking like this picture here. This is in Chicago. If I didn't have the picture there, the sign of the Chicago Foods Depository, maybe you think this is a Walmart or some sort of Costco or a large, food warehouse of some sort. So the food bank is the large warehouse that collects, systematizes, and delivers surplus food to local beneficiary organizations. So food banks don't give food to people, they give food to organizations, to the beneficiaries, meaning the food pantries, the shelters that then give it to people. Food banks started in the 1960s in Arizona, spread across the United States in the 70s and 80s as there were economic recessions and some pullback of some social welfare support. Of course, there's a big history of food banks in Canada, across Europe, and this really expanded quite significantly in the latter part of the 20th century. Towards the 21st century, that's when food banks really became, I would argue, institutionalized. They kind of shifted from what might be viewed as a temporary institution to sort of a permanent institution. Here in the US, if you drive around, you'll often see signs that say 1 in 6 people food insecure, 1 in 7. There are billboards everywhere, and they're all promoting the food bank. And food banks deliberately have sort of designed themselves to be more apolitical. They do some lot of lobbying and advocacy, but they're very careful politically to not step in any toes, right? Which has been sort of a double-edged sword in terms of their mission. But they, as opposed to when you think about, again, here in the States, food stamps, or in other contexts, if you're thinking about, support for food and income support programs, can be a little bit more politicized. Food banks have tried to, and arguably successfully, sort of sidestep that. Again, in the United States, we're talking about 200 member food banks, 60,000 local beneficiary organizations. So not only are they institutionalized, but they're in every major city in the US. And again, this has become more common in a lot of the wealthier parts of the globe, in Canada, US, Australia, Europe, and elsewhere. Another way to look at it, in addition to the map, is a listing here, and you can see that food banks now are actually in all corners of the world, and they're tied to these 3 big networks that I'm going to talk about briefly: the GFN, Global Food Banking Network; FBRN, Food Banking Regional Network; and FEBA in Europe. So they each have a different geographical sort of footprint. So the GFN is based out of Chicago. This is the network that is related to the US Feeding America network. So this is a spinoff of Feeding America, operates on 6 continents. What's important about the GFN is they train and they actually certify food banks. So they're very deliberate about who they choose for their network and some of the certification processes. And again, most of the food in this food banking model is from the private sector, the surplus food, but some of it also is government commodities and from other sources as well. The second big network here is FIBA, the European Food Banks Federation, headquartered in Brussels. That's not by accident. It was in Paris. Now it's in Brussels as to be closer to the EU in terms of the administrative offices. Most countries across Europe now have a food banking network. They're particularly strong in parts of the South. Spain, Italy, France, as well as Germany have very large food bank systems. And it's interesting because, of course, there's large welfare states in Europe, but these systems have developed in part to repurpose surplus food. And so these numbers, of course, keep going up, up and up, and have a very large presence. Of course, again, the EU is a very big supporter of this mode of food waste and food insecurity reduction. The third network is called the FBRN, the Food Banking Regional Network. This is out of Dubai, primarily in Asia and Africa. But, you know, when you speak to folks who work there, you know, the person who runs it, he told me that, you know, the origins really of the FBRN and still the strength is what he calls the Arab region of Southwestern Asia. So while there's a presence, you would think by looking at the map across Africa and some parts of South Asia, those food banks aren't actually as developed. So as opposed to the GFN, which certifies and trains and monitors, the FBRN sort of says, okay, you're started and there you go. So it's a little bit different kind of network, the limited monitoring and support. Also, of course, in some of these contexts being very different with a much more underdeveloped social welfare state context. And these are the 5 pillars for the FBRN. So we don't have a lot of time today, so I just wanted to give you kind of an overview. Those are the 3 networks that I just mentioned in the GFN, FIBA, and the FBRN. Here's a couple case studies that are interesting. I spent a lot of time on Food Forward South Africa. It used to be called Food Bank South Africa. This is an important case study because it is oftentimes referred to as the pilot case for the GFN. They deliberately picked a country in sub-Saharan Africa that had high poverty, high inequality rates, but had a relatively stable government buy-in to the food banking network, and had very well-developed large food retailers. Because what we've seen over and over again is that food banks work best in places that have surplus food, which is going to be from your formal food retailers. And so that's a very important aspect. What's happened over the years, because this organization has started in about 2007, 2008, 2009. It's now in most major cities across South Africa. They've struggled in the rural areas, but that is something that they've been working on. And of course, in South Africa and many parts of the global South, the rural food insecurity question is very different. And food banking, if you think about it in a different way, really is about logistics. It's about getting surplus food from the food company warehouse to the food banking warehouse. So in urban areas, it's going to work better because the infrastructure is going to be more well-developed and it's going to be closer together. There's been some challenges with capacity, funding issues. There's already organizations that work in this space. Probably one of the biggest changes is that the government support has kind of fallen off. This organization, Food Forward South Africa, has deliberately kind of separated itself from government. And is now a completely independent NGO and very closely aligned with the corporate sector. And so that's important because, you know, government was initially a big supporter of it and is now not really that involved in this organization. Another organization that's very interesting is the India Food Banking Network. There's more than one food banking organization that works in India, but this is one of the big ones. Like South Africa, very unequal society, high poverty rate. What's different here is you have, you know, the scale of food insecurity, particularly in the rural areas, is quite dramatic. And while the Food Banking Network, you know, is here in India is working on, you know, programs, it really doesn't match the need that's out there in a couple key ways. And this is something that folks who run the GFN will tell you. They will say one of the challenges they had in India was that the way that food banks traditionally work doesn't really work well in India. So in South Africa, of course, informal settlements, the structure of the food system there is, of course, very different from it is like in North America. But in India, it's even more different. People are getting fresh food more often, less packaged food. If you've ever been to India, you know, getting from point A to point B is very difficult. And so doing the reverse logistics of food banking is very difficult and very challenged. Also, the government in India, they say, yeah, what you're doing is nice and it's fine, but again, it's small potatoes. It's a small charity in a sea of great need. And so in India, the you know the scale of food insecurity is so great that there's still a sense that that the food bank is not going to make as much difference maybe as folks have want. So there's different challenges in different places, and this is really just the tip of the iceberg in the global South, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. One thing I also wanted to mention is, you know, I'm doing this work on my book, and a couple years ago, I guess now 4 years ago, COVID happens. And so I think, well, great, there goes the research. And of course, we know for those of us who do food that COVID became the research. You all know a lot of these statistics. Food insecurity doubled during that period. In places where there's been large stimulus packages in the wealthier parts of the world, food insecurity, interestingly, has not gone up as much as expected because of those great government interventions to support food and income programs. But in other places, many of the middle and lower income parts of the world, that has been more of a challenge because those governments didn't have the resources, the capacity to invest in those ways in stimulus packages. And so we see lingering effects from COVID in that way. We also know that, you know, what COVID did related to food systems is really peel the outer layers of the onion. And it showed us that we're very susceptible. You know, food systems are already sprawling and unstable in some places, but became completely unwound during the COVID months and years. We saw, you know, limited food access, changes in terms of production, people having, of course, you know, increased prices, which has stayed with us, changes in supply chain, et cetera. Related to food waste, we saw record amounts of food waste, food left on fields, a lot of ad hoc solutions. And so in this space where food banks operate, we saw really a crisis around food insecurity and food waste. And in the Europe context, and I could, you know, this is just something that I spent some time on, but, you know, you could have a similar map. Of course, it was quite traumatic quite quickly. If we remember in Europe, particularly in places like in Italy, it became really bad really quickly when we didn't know a lot about what was going on. And for food banks, what happened is they found themselves more visible on the front lines. People were looking to them as governments were maybe a little bit flat-footed at first during those couple months of March to June of 2020. So there was, of course, great increases in demand, higher costs. There wasn't as much food being donated. It was actually being thrown out. In terms of volunteers, a lot of them were over 65, so they weren't able to be in the food bank warehouse, and they didn't have the safety equipment for volunteers. So what we really found ourselves in was finding that the food bank network was really under tremendous pressure. And in many cases, a lot of the charities closed. And in fact, 10 to 50% of charities, the beneficiary charities, the food bank, food pantries, right? The organizations that food banks support closed during those few months. And that was critical because those are the months that, you know, food support was needed the most. In Europe, really, in all honesty, it's been one crisis after another. There was COVID, then there was inflation, which has really been a global phenomenon, although you know, not different in different parts of the world. And then the war in Ukraine, which meant a rapid increase in the number of refugees. It meant increase in energy costs, which also then increased cost of living. So really the last 4 years, and I'm looking at Europe, but really I could be looking at food banks more generally, has been really a one series, one crisis after another. And it's been very interesting to watch food banks in these different contexts try to work through these challenges. In some places, food banks leveraged that crisis to have record amounts of fundraising, which increased their operations. In other places, it became a challenge to keep the doors open. So, as we don't have a lot of time today, you're probably curious about, what does all this mean more broadly when we're trying to think about food banks? And so here's some thoughts. I think COVID in particular emphasized the fragility of the charity-based food system. It's a vulnerable patchwork. The food bank systems that were developed in these different parts of the world were not designed for this type of a crisis. But when the crisis emerged, were put right there front and center. Food banks, the research on their impacts on food insecurity and food waste is unclear. There's many intervening variables that come when you think about the role of the changing economy, the role of government, global factors, different regional factors that impact food insecurity. So it is hard to figure out, does one small intervention of food bank reduce food insecurity? Because people who work at food banks will tell you we have had record amounts of meals delivered, record amounts of food delivered, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they've reduced food insecurity. Food waste, estimates have shown between 1% and 3% of food wasted is repurposed by food banks. So again, food banks getting a lot of attention, but arguably their impact might be a little bit smaller than some might suggest. I mentioned that during COVID, food insecurity wasn't as high as expected in the year or two just afterwards. And part of that was because of the value of these food and income support programs by government. I think that's something that needs to be emphasized. So, where can we go from here? What can we say the impacts are? Some more questions for us, I can give you some findings and some data, but I also think that good research also presents some new questions. So I say, what are the measurable outcomes? Because everyone always comes up to me and they say, do food banks make a difference? What can you tell us? And as I said, the research is, it's hard to isolate the role of food banks. Again, as I mentioned, number of pounds delivered or kilograms delivered of food or meals, number of volunteers served. Yes, we know that food banks are growing in size, but are they reducing the metrics, the food insecurity, food waste that they say they want to? And this is something that we really need more hard work to figure out, and I think is very difficult. What's the ideal role of food banks within food policy? I'm a person who thinks that food banks can play a role, but they probably need to play a much more targeted role, a much more realistic role, maybe more of a niche role. In some contexts, corporate food waste is going to be thrown out, and there's an opportunity for food banks to repurpose that. But maybe in the big picture, that's not going to solve all the food waste crisis, but it's going to be a small part of the solution. So there is a potential role. But as you see from my questions 3 and 4 here, yes, but can they play a big role in parts of the global south, particularly where the informal sector plays a big role? And of course, that's where food banks are running into the greatest challenges, as I mentioned briefly in India and South Africa. You talk to folks at the Global Food Banking Network, they want to expand. They have a big presence, if you looked on that map, across the Americas from north to south, FIBA in Europe and then in Australia. But sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, that's the place that the GFN wants to expand. And those are the places that have, yes, the biggest food insecurity rates, but they also probably have the biggest challenges in terms of food bank development. The food corporation sector is not as well developed there. The structure of the food system may not really be the ideal fit for a food banking system. And this is important because GFN and FIBA and the FBRN are elevating their conversation to the UN. They want to be in there as a key solution for sustainable development goal that relates to food waste and relates to food insecurity. So they're trying to position themselves at that high level. And it's important that we are aware of their strengths and their limitations and the limits of where they can operate well. And so, we want to think about, is the food banking network that we're seeing here, is this something that is another development project from the wealthier corners of the world that's being, exported to the global South, and another example of a misfit in terms of reading a local context? Possibly. In some of these different food bank locations, there is a lot of interest from folks working in those locales. I'll be talking in a bit, about it's soon going to be going to Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana, some of these other places where these food banks are to develop. There is some interest from the local players there, but again, we have to really take this with a critical eye here. So some takeaway messages. I would say, firstly, we need to kind of reframe the discussion on food insecurity and food waste. Oftentimes, food banks will tell you that the solution to food insecurity is to repurpose food waste. And we have to be careful there. Why are people food insecure? People are food insecure because of the cost of food and the ability of limited purchasing power in food markets, poverty. Food waste is about inefficiencies in the global food system. And so importantly, we're not necessarily going to feed all the food insecurity people across the globe by simply repurposing food waste. I think that's important. As I mentioned, to number 2 here, I do think food banks potentially can play a small role in certain contexts, but we have to be really think through hard about what context this might be. Number 3 here, in addition to food banks, we have to be thinking about the food system more broadly. That means we have to think about the role of government and states. What's state responsibility around food and income support programs? They're always going to have a much bigger impact because of the scale. And we can be pushing various governments to be supporting the right to food as a basic human right. Food companies, they like to talk a lot about the record amounts of food that they donate. Okay, but what about your wages that you're paying your workers? Do you sell nutritious food? And are you, what's your role in terms of, being on the board of a lot of food banks? A lot of food companies are actually boxing in food banks politically because they're on their boards. Yes, they donate a lot of money in food, but then they limit the food bank's ability to make some tough decisions. Number 5, when we're thinking about, places like South Africa, I can tell you that have the knowledge and experiences of the food insecure been integrated into the food bank operations? That's part of the reason that food banks have been challenged in South Africa and in India in terms of their development, is because these are some old themes here, but about not understanding local context and about top-driven development projects from the outside. And so we have to really think hard about how a food system is structured and what role, if any, a food bank might play. And again, where are the limits of food banks? I'd say, well, definitely in informal economies, rural areas, and in all honesty, in many parts of the global South. I'm continuing to track this. I told you I've been looking at food banks for a while. I guess I can't quit researching them. I just came back in May from Lisbon, in Prague, and Athens, looking at European food banks and these multiple crises I was telling you about since COVID, with inflation, the war in Ukraine. I'm also going in the fall in East Africa. I'll be going in November to Uganda and Ethiopia and Kenya to be looking at some of these food banks to see what the development process is going like there. Interestingly, if you look at that map, food banks are popping up across sub-Saharan Africa. And so it'd be very interesting to see why these different particular places have been chosen and what challenges they may run into. So that's it for me in terms of my presentation. I really appreciate your listening, and I'm really excited to hear some of your thoughts and some of your questions. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dan. Really fascinating and provocative. I'll just ask those attending if you do have any questions, just to post them in the Q&A, and I'll pass them on as a basis for discussion. Before we get to those, let me start with a big question, Dan, which I think you kind of certainly gestured to, but it comes out of a fundamental conclusion, which you draw in introduction to the book. And you say that, let me just quote, rather than addressing the root causes of food insecurity and waste, governments and corporations promote food banks as a way to deflect attention from their own institutional shortcomings. In this way, food corporations and governments may be benefiting more from food banks than the food insecure. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on what you see as being those institutional shortcomings, and also your conclusion that corporations and governments are actually the main beneficiaries of food banks.
Yeah, no, thanks. You're right. I mean, that's sort of one of my key takeaways or themes that I have in the book is that in many ways what food banks are is speaking to the limits of charity. And so it makes people feel good that we participate in these big networks that redistribute food. And there's a lot of history of people working in local volunteer organizations to try to make a difference. But what's really happened over the last, 20 years in particular is part of the reason that food banks have been elevated, in my opinion, so much is that these key institutions that you mentioned have really taken to food banks. And they've taken to food banks, food companies, because they see an opportunity for brand enhancement where they can donate food at record levels and get good press for that. And if you go to a lot of the large food companies and you go in their sustainability reports or whatever they call them, sometimes the names of those reports have changed. They will often talk about, how much food waste has been diverted, how many people have been fed, and they love those numbers. And what they don't talk about in the report is, how much they're paying workers, what role these large food companies play in food system inequality and some of those big challenges. Also, the more you push on it, it's unclear how much of an impact, all those big metrics really play. Like I said, with food waste, 1 to 3% is the estimate of food waste that's being diverted by food banks. And the truth is, how much more can they divert? Because they're only really focusing on surplus food. They're not looking at food waste across the food waste, the food system. And food companies, again, when they give you these stats, they'll say, we increasingly waste, like a zero waste approach. You don't really have the data at hand. It's private data that is competitive data. So you don't really know what's going on. All you know is the big picture about what they keep promoting. And there's a lot of competition for companies to look like sustainable actors. And so that's part of what's happening. Governments in many contexts really, been promoting food banks because it's an excellent, for them, all they have to do basically is, I mean, again, if you go out on the street and you say, how do people feel about food banks? Generally, the feel is very positive. It's not a very politicized institution by design. And so governments can sort of take credit for, promoting this institution without really anything that would be sort of negative when they invest in a much larger scale initiative that might involve tax increases, or it might involve something that might be a little bit more controversial. So yeah, I think it really is about, you have to ask yourself why food banks expanded so rapidly. Food banks have really positioned themselves well to get the support of these really powerful institutions. And, we really have to be careful about not thinking that food banks are all good or all bad. Like most initiatives, it's a mix, but to be just realistic, to ask the tough questions, to ask, well, where do food banks operate well, and what does operating well mean? Do they even meet their own mission? So these are some of the tough questions I think we have to ask. Thanks.
So there, just some follow-up to that. I mean, you made the point. I don't want to focus too specifically on the South African case, but you made the point that it was one of the first countries in the global South that was targeted for this food bank development. But I think in your talk, which I wasn't aware of, you said that actually government had withdrawn its support. So it seems to be, contrary to the points just made about, very valid point about governments benefiting from this. So, so two questions. I mean, why has that happened? Is it central or local government or both? And does this in some way, it's just an anomalous case, or is this something that's going to happen more broadly?
Right. No, that's a great point. A lot of the reason these food banks get off the ground is because of government support. But sometimes over time, and in the South African case, it was the central government at the highest levels, the highest ministries. Were supportive, they were giving money. But what frustrated the food bank folks in the South African case was that you would have a lot of empty promises, money that wouldn't come through that was promised, or people taking credit for stuff but actually not doing the work. So some of those kinds of challenges. And that isn't unique to South Africa. Actually, even in certain places in Europe or in other parts of the world, I would see that being told to me. So often what's interesting is while government has a lot of opportunity to take advantage of the role the food banks are playing, it isn't actually consistent. And what I have actually seen is increasingly food banks are being funded more independently, more by corporations and individuals, less by government. But government can often find different ways to be support the food bank. It could be something as simple as, like in the US, you will always find a presidential candidate visit a food bank, but they're not going to visit a food stamp office or something. They're going to visit a food bank because it's viewed as safe territory. So there's ways to kind of utilize, those kind of relationships. But I think you're right, it's evolving when you think about the role of food bank government relations and food bank corporate relations. Food bank corporate relations have evolved over the last 20 years to be arguably more important than the food bank government relations, and the government component has been more uneven by context.
Okay. Thanks. So some questions that have started to pop up in the Q&A. This one, I guess, there's a couple of questions that relate more to the character of food banks. One is, and I suppose this varies from place to place, but you might want to talk about those variations, which is exactly what kinds of products are available through the food banks. The question is it just groceries or prepared meals? And I suppose from my point of view, it's also about, I'm just recalling a visit to the food bank in Cape Town, and it was all processed foods. There didn't seem anything fresh there at all, despite the fact that the location was in a fresh food market for the food bank. So that's the one question, and then the other is about access, the question is about speaking a little bit more about the politicization of food banks, which you alluded to. And the example given, which you may or may not be familiar with, is that in Canada, a food bank in Toronto actually banned international students from accessing food bank, arguing that the food bank is meant to serve the domestic population. And the question is this widespread experience In other words, who actually benefits and are certain people excluded?
Thanks for those questions. The question of the quality of the food has been really a criticism of food banks for decades upon decades. And some food banks, particularly if they're a little bit wealthier food banks, like in the Chicago case, they have started to purchase fresh food to offset some of the um, let's say less healthy food that they're getting. Because you're right, the critique is, okay, the food company has extra Lipton tea, and then they have extra, random item of this and random item of that, and this is a meal. This is what I'm getting. So that critique is there, and I think that is particularly worrisome with a lot of the food banks that just start out because they don't have the capacity to offset that with purchasing fresh food. So some food banks are very aware of that. And so it's interesting, so I've been tracking this over the years, a conversation with the Chicago Food Depository in 2021, they'll talk a lot about fresh food. In 2006, it was nowhere in the conversation. And so things have evolved because of a lot of the criticism. And again, it's uneven in terms of that, but that definitely is really a limit in the model because it's surplus food is really what the food companies don't need. And so that, of course, is going to be random in terms of that. The second point about, who does it serve is a very interesting example that you mentioned, Toronto. And boy, the food banks have stepped in some tough ones. In Germany, there was an issue when it was the Syrian refugee crisis. And there was also the question about who's deserving of food aid and who is not. So this is something that has come up and has played out differently in different places. And in fact, in the German example, that went all the way up to, I think Angela Merkel at the time even mentioned something about what was going on there. So, even though food banks are, they try to position themselves as apolitical, they still, you have this food bank warehouse, but then you have the local food beneficiaries, your food pantries and the like, and those are going to reflect different community perspectives and different mission, et cetera. And those usually what happens is the food bank doesn't decide who gets the food, it's the local pantry. And so you'll have a very uneven sort of perspectives on that. And so that is an interesting example, you're right, where it plays out very differently in different contexts. And that's another way to think about, who does the food bank serve? Because your initial question was, my book, I say, okay, does it actually serve some of these powerful institutions, the state and the food companies, and those are the ones who benefit. But in the example, the one you just gave right now, interestingly, you could argue, who does it serve in terms of, folks that are going to be receiving food. At the university I work at, we have a food pantry. Food pantries are becoming increasingly common across universities, at least in the US. And there's the question of, well, who does it serve? Is it for students? Is it for people who live within a certain distance? And so I think all of these pantries and this whole broader network of emergency food systems have to make those tough decisions. So I think that's a really interesting example. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, thanks. Just to follow up on that, I mean, there's a couple of questions. Let me try to put them together around cultural food needs. So one person's asking whether what are the limitations to this charity model in addressing cultural food needs of diverse communities, particularly in the West. So that's one part of it. And then the other related issue is, can food banks actually ensure that they provide culturally appropriate food while most of the donations they receive are non-perishable canned food, from supermarkets?
Right. No, absolutely. I think, culture is really embedded in it's one of the key reasons why in South Africa and India, you have some of these challenges. But as you said, it's also in North America, it's in Europe, it's in, you think about cities that are extremely diverse with extremely different communities in terms of the kinds of foods they eat. The food bank is receiving food from food companies. And absolutely it's going to be uneven. There has to be an opportunity where either the food bank is going to purchase food that's food appropriate, or the local food pantry, or they're going to have to rethink exactly what kind of food is going to be available. And so I think you might get a different answer from the central food bank warehouse, which is really going to be one large warehouse, probably for a whole large metro area. And then that's going to differ from what these local food pantries are, who really are going to have better sense of what kind of food people are going to eat. I think that's there's different disjunctures, I guess you could say, around where this happens. There's the food bank, people working there, and they're speaking to food companies or to the global food banking network staff. And some of those conversations, there might be a limited understanding of how a place might actually operate in a local context. But if you go to the, community-based organizations, if it's in a township or an informal settlement or a different local community, people might have a better sense of what exactly is people might eat. And so I think that is a conversation that's critical. One thing I put towards the end of the slide deck was about integrating and understanding the knowledge and experiences of the food insecure, because a lot of the time there's challenges about understanding what food insecurity means in a different context, what kind of foods people access, what different food pathways exist. And so you can't really start thinking about the solutions to these questions when you don't even understand how people eat to begin with. So I think that question is really important, and particularly important as the food bank system is trying to expand to different corners of the globe. And importantly, I appreciate the question where the emphasis was on even within wealthier corners of the globe where we have very diverse cities. So that's a really, really important point. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks. So someone raises another experience. Let me just read this out. I noticed that China wasn't mentioned in this discussion, or perhaps I missed it. Would you happen to know how food surpluses are managed there? So that's one part of the question. But also in the Chinese context, there's this huge concern with food safety.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a general question, which is whether you've come across any concerns about food safety risks associated with food banks in your fieldwork.
I have not visited the food bank in China. There is one, of course, geopolitical issues do make some of these relationships a bit more, they've changed over time. Like in the Ukraine situation, the war going on there, that involved a lot of East and Central European countries to be very involved. FIBA made a decision to be very active in the support of folks there. The GFN is out of the United States, and so that's important because when folks are going to different corners of the globe, they might be perceived differently in different places. And they have a food bank that's operating in China that's been there for a while. I don't know as much about the specifics, but I do appreciate the question also, because if you think also about speaking about culture, some of the food bank, like food waste practices, if you think about in Korea and Japan, and China as well, the relationship with food waste is going to be very different and arguably a lot more advanced in terms of what's sort of integrated in terms of the culture, in terms of here I struggle to get people to think about, like, okay, what's our relationship with food in terms of the waste question, and it's very different in that part of the world. But there is a food bank that the GFN is affiliated with, both in China and I think they're developing, let's see, there's in Thailand and Singapore, Vietnam, Taiwan. They have various different places that they're promoting different food banks, and it's all on the map. You can just see what they have there. But the other part about the food safety is a major concern for a lot of food bank partners. So a lot of the food companies, they are in some contexts where food banking is new, a little bit more hesitant to partner with food banks because they're a little bit concerned about the safety question. They don't want their foods being resold in black markets, and they don't want food to be resold on they don't want people to get ill, of course. So those are two big areas of concern. And so, you know, that has kind of limited some of the corporate involvement. In some places, there's laws that promoting food safety or ensure safety liability for some of the companies, which has helped with some of the food waste donations, but it varies by context. So I think the question around food safety is very important because there's a lot of concern, rightly so, that things are done well and that people are going to be not get sick. And so that's been a sticking point in certain contexts.
It's a kind of counterintuitive question raised by a couple of people. And just, I think it'd be interesting to hear your response to it. So the kind of way in which you presented it, you have food there is surplus food. Mm-hmm. And then the food banks kind of step in to redistribute that food. I suppose the question is being posed, if you turn that around, do food banks' presence or availability actually encourage the creation of surplus food?
Right.
Of course, only some of which would go to food banks.
Right. This is one of the central contradictions of food banks, is that they are supposedly trying to reduce food waste, but they're dependent on food waste, surplus food in particular. You know, you pose that question to people run food banks, they say, oh, we want food banks to go out of business. You know, and it's almost becomes like an empty line that people always sort of repeat, because while that, you know, food banks are just increasing in size. And in part because you know, they're riding the wave of increased fundraising with a lot of these crises that have been going on, and they've been able to expand their operations. But I think that's a central contradiction that you bring up around food waste, around surplus food. And so, you know, that's where you really have to kind of scratch your head and think about, well, what are these food banks really doing? And are we maybe focusing on the wrong point in the food system around this question around surplus food? But for the moment, that's what's happening, and that's where the food is going to the food bank from the food companies.
Okay, we've kind of run out of time, Dan, and still I see more questions here coming in. I'm sure that people want to pursue the discussion with you. They could email you. For those present, thanks very much for attending. Urge you to order a copy of this great book, Food Waste, Food Insecurity, and the Globalization of Food Banks. And Dan also contributed actually a chapter to our recent Elgar handbook on urban food security in the Global South, looking specifically at food banks in countries in the Global South. So, Dan, thanks so much for this fascinating and insightful presentation. I would just finally say that we'll be taking a short pause in our MiFOOD webinar series for the next couple of months, and we'll be starting up again in August or September. So again, thank you very much to everybody. And finally, special thanks to you, Dan, for a great presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions. Thanks.